Monday was supposed to be about black coffee and supply chain logistics, until I doubled back for a forgotten set of keys. I found my husband in his Range Rover, his crisp Brooks Brothers shirt unbuttoned to the sternum. Our interior designer's hand was resting intimately against his chest, right where my head used to lie. That moment did not make me scream. It turned me from a devoted wife into the coldest auditor he would ever encounter. My name is Mallory, and if there is one thing 34 years on this earth and a career as the logistics director at Stratus Global has taught me, it is that there is no such thing as an accident, only poor planning. My life is a grid of optimized routes and synchronized calendars. I do not tolerate lateness, and I certainly do not tolerate waste. Efficiency is not just my profession, it is my religion. The morning began as a standard operational procedure. Oak Brook, Illinois, wakes up differently than the rest of the world. The silence here is heavy, weighed down by the price per square foot of the limestone mansions and the perfectly manicured lawns that are turning brittle under the chill of late autumn. It is a wealthy silence, the kind that is supposed to insulate you from the messy realities of life, but often just muffles the sound of things breaking apart behind closed doors. The sky was a flat, unyielding gray, threatening a rain that had not yet committed to falling. I was 20 minutes into my commute, mentally rehearsing the quarterly variance report, when the realization hit me with the dull thud of a dropped shipping container. My high-level security badge and the master keys to the cold storage facility were sitting on the granite island in the kitchen. It was a rookie error, a deviation from the protocol that irritated me more than the traffic. I ran the mental math immediately. If I executed a U-turn at the next intersection and maintained an average speed of 45 miles per hour, the detour would cost me exactly 12 minutes. I could retrieve the keys and still walk into the 9 o'clock board meeting with 3 minutes to spare. I swung my Volvo XC90 around, the tires gripping the asphalt with reassuring stability. I drove back toward the sanctuary of my subdivision, expecting an empty house. Preston, my husband, had explicitly stated he had a breakfast meeting with a high-profile client in downtown Chicago. He had complained about the early start time while adjusting his tie in the mirror, making a show of his dedication to his real estate empire. But when I turned the corner onto our street, the data did not match the projection. Preston was not in Chicago. His black Range Rover was parked aggressively at the top of our driveway, blocking the garage. My brain stalled for a microsecond, trying to reconcile his schedule with visual reality, before I instinctively pulled my car to the curb, 2 houses away behind a large oak tree. I stared through the windshield. The Range Rover was not empty. Preston was in the driver's seat, and the window was rolled down halfway despite the biting cold. He was not alone. In the passenger seat sat Sienna, the interior designer we had hired 4 months ago to refresh the living room. She was supposed to be picking out drapes, not sitting in my husband's car at 8:40 in the morning. Then, the visual input became granular, and the nausea hit. Preston's white dress shirt, the one I had ironed with starch just an hour ago, was unbuttoned to the middle of his chest. It was sloppy. It was raw. Sienna's hand was not on the dashboard or a sample book. It was sliding up his exposed neck, her fingers tangling into the hair at the nape of his neck. They were laughing. It was not a polite, professional chuckle. It was the wet, breathless laughter of shared intimacy, a sound that implies a secret language I was never meant to hear. A normal wife might have slammed on the gas, screeched up the driveway, and screamed until the neighbors called the police. But I am not a normal wife. I am a crisis manager. As I watched them, a switch flipped in the back of my mind. The emotional center of my brain was immediately quarantined, walled off by thick layers of ice. The logical center took command. This was no longer a marriage. It was a compromised asset. It was a supply chain failure that required immediate damage assessment and risk mitigation. I did not shake. I reached for my phone with a steady hand and opened the camera app. I zoomed in to the maximum optical capacity. Click. I captured the license plate. Click. I captured the timestamp. Click. I captured the undeniable angle of her hand on his skin and the lust plastered across his face. I took 10 photos in rapid succession, ensuring the metadata was tagged with the location. Once the data was secured, I put the car in reverse. I did not go get my keys. The meeting at Stratus Global was no longer the priority. I backed the Volvo away slowly, the engine purring so quietly it was swallowed by the wind. I drove out of the subdivision without looking back, navigating toward a coffee shop 3 miles away. I needed a table, Wi-Fi, and silence to restructure the entire operational plan of my life. My heart had not broken. It had simply ceased to function as a human organ and had become a cold, mechanical pump fueling a war machine. The porcelain cup in my hand was vibrating against the saucer, creating a tiny, irritating clatter in the otherwise silent coffee shop. The place was nearly empty, save for a barista looking bored behind the counter and a student typing furiously in the corner. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling violently. It was not grief. I checked my internal emotional state and found 0 traces of sorrow. This was adrenaline. It was the pure, high-octane fuel of rage that had been pressurized and injected directly into my bloodstream. My body was preparing for a fight, even if my mind was currently drafting a spreadsheet. I took a sip of black coffee, the bitterness grounding me, and forced my hands to be still. I needed to process the data. I began to run a retrospective analysis of Preston's schedule over the last 6 months. At the time, I had accepted his excuses as standard operating variables. The sudden emergency trips to verify construction materials in Milwaukee, the Thursday night golf games that dragged on until 1 in the morning because the clubhouse service was slow, the cash withdrawals from our joint savings account that he claimed were for tipping contractors and site laborers. Viewed individually, they were minor anomalies. Viewed collectively through the lens of what I had just witnessed in the driveway, they formed a clear, linear trend line of betrayal. The correlation was mathematically impossible to ignore. We had hired Sienna 4 months ago to modernize the living room. That timing aligned perfectly with the week Preston changed his phone passcode and suddenly decided to start lifting weights at a gym across town. I had attributed his new fitness regimen to a mid-30s health kick. Now I realized it was merely a marketing rebranding for a new target demographic. I opened my laptop, the screen glowing blue in the dim light of the cafe. I did not go to my work email. Instead, I navigated to the Fortress Smart Home interface. I was the primary administrator. Preston was merely a user with limited permissions, a fact he never cared about because he found technology tedious. I, however, found it useful. I pulled up the system logs for the past 90 days. The data was damning in its silence. The camera in the garage, which usually recorded on a motion sensor, showed a pattern of manual disengagement every Tuesday and Thursday between 11 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. Someone was turning it off. However, the idiot had forgotten the doorbell camera. It was on a separate circuit. I scrolled through the timestamps. There she was. Sienna, entering my front door at 11:15 on a Tuesday, entering again at noon on a Thursday. She was not carrying fabric swatches or paint samples. She was carrying a bottle of wine. A notification slid across the top of my phone screen. It was a text from Preston. Honey, meeting just finished. Going to check on the site downtown. Might be a little late tonight. Love you. I stared at the words. The lie was so smooth, so practiced. It was a template he had probably used a dozen times before. A wave of physical revulsion washed over me, stronger than the nausea I had felt in the car. This was not heartbreak. This was the realization that my 8-year marriage was a toxic asset. It was a project that had failed to meet its KPIs and was now bleeding capital and dignity. In the business world, when a project fails this badly, you do not throw more money at it. You liquidate it. My thumb hovered over the call button. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to tell him I knew he was currently sitting in our driveway with his mistress while lying to me about being downtown. But I stopped. Preston was the director of real estate sales. He was a professional manipulator. If I confronted him now, while I was shaking and emotional, he would spin the narrative. He would gaslight me. He would claim they were just talking, that she was comforting him, that I was crazy. He would hide the money. He would delete the texts. I needed to control the narrative. I needed to control the exit strategy. I placed the phone down and did something I had not done in 5 years. I called my assistant at Stratus Global. "I'm sick," I told her, my voice steady. "I have a severe migraine and will be unreachable for 24 hours. It was the first lie I had told in our professional relationship, but it was necessary. I needed this time to conduct a full audit of my life. I looked at the empty chair across from me. I realized then that while I had the data, and I had the rage, I did not have the manpower. A divorce involving this level of deceit and financial complexity was not a solo operation. Preston had his boys' club, his network of enablers. I could not fight a war on this scale alone. I needed specialists. I needed allies who were just as angry and twice as dangerous. I arranged to meet Blair at the Vault, a subterranean wine bar in the city that required a membership just to walk through the door. It was dark, quiet, and discreet, the kind of place where 7-figure deals were closed in hushed tones. Blair was already there, nursing a glass of Pinot Noir. We had been friends since our freshman year of college, but the woman sitting across from me was not just my sorority sister. She was one of the most feared divorce attorneys in Chicago. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I unlocked my phone and slid it across the mahogany table, displaying the photos from that morning. Blair looked at them. She did not gasp. She did not offer me a tissue. She simply took a sip of her wine and zoomed in on the image of Preston's unbuttoned shirt. She looked up at me, her eyes sharp and devoid of pity. "Crying is for amateurs," she said. "Get your head in the game. Mallory, right now, you are a liability to yourself because you are emotional." She leaned in, her voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "If you confront him without leverage, he will hide the money in offshore accounts before you can serve him the papers. You need undeniable proof of infidelity and financial misconduct if you want to bypass the prenup and take him for everything he is worth." As Blair was outlining the difference between a forensic accountant and a private investigator, a shadow fell over our table. It was Naomi. We played tennis together on Thursdays, but Naomi was not just a suburban mom with a backhand. She was a senior cybersecurity analyst for a defense contractor. She had spotted us from the bar and walked over, but her usual bright smile was missing. "What are you two plotting?" she asked, looking back and forth between our grim faces. I hesitated, but Blair nodded. I told Naomi everything. I told her about the keys, the driveway, and the interior designer who was redesigning my marriage into a ruin. Naomi did not look surprised. She pulled out a chair and sat down, her shoulders slumping. "I've been tracking Greg for weeks," she confessed. Greg and Preston were best friends. They had been inseparable since business school. "Greg has been making strange cash withdrawals and going on weekend fishing trips to Wisconsin," Naomi continued. "Yet he never comes back with any fish, and his gear never looks used." The pieces began to click together like a high-speed assembly line. I realized that every time Preston had an emergency business trip, Greg was supposedly fishing. They were covering for each other. It was not just 2 isolated incidents of bad judgment. Blair set her glass down hard. "This is a syndicate," she declared. "It's a little boys' club where they pool their resources to fund their midlife crises while we manage their homes and raise their credit scores." A memory flashed in my mind, sharp and sudden. I remembered a conversation with Sienna in my living room weeks ago. She had been showing me fabric swatches and casually mentioned her friend Kiki, an Instagram model who was looking for investors for a swimsuit line. "Check Greg's social media," I told Naomi. Naomi pulled out her phone. Within 30 seconds, she confirmed the data. "He likes every single photo Kiki posts, usually within minutes of them going live." The picture was complete. Sienna and Kiki, Preston and Greg. We looked at each other. The atmosphere at the table shifted. We were no longer 3 victims swapping sad stories. We were a logistics expert, a legal shark, and a cybersecurity genius. We had every skill set required to dismantle a corporation And that was exactly how we were going to treat our marriages. "We are not just going for a divorce," Blair stated, her eyes gleaming. "A simple divorce is a negotiation. We are going for total asset seizure and reputation destruction. We move as a unit." I took charge of the operations. I would map out their schedules, track their physical movements, and coordinate our strikes. Naomi would handle the digital warfare, cracking their passwords, retrieving deleted messages, and following the money trail through the cloud. Blair would handle the legal strategy, preparing the filings to ensure that when we finally dropped the hammer, they would not be able to wiggle out of the trap. We needed a name for the mission. I looked at the empty wine glass and thought about my warehouse floor, about the process of removing old, damaged inventory to make room for new, profitable stock. "Operation Clearance," I said. "The goal is 0 inventory remaining." We clinked our glasses. The war had officially begun. Naomi operated with the terrifying silence of a predator. She sat at my dining room table, her fingers flying across a backlit keyboard, dismantling the digital privacy of our husbands with a few keystrokes. She had bypassed the standard encryption on the family accounts by exploiting the fact that men like Preston and Greg were creatures of habit who reused the same passwords for their fantasy football leagues and their banking apps. The first domino to fall was the location history. I stood behind Naomi, watching the blue dots on the map retrace Preston's movements over the last month. I pulled up my own calendar on my tablet to cross-reference the data. 2 weeks ago, Preston had claimed he was in Detroit inspecting a distressed industrial property for a potential acquisition. He had complained about the smog and the terrible hotel coffee. The GPS data from the Range Rover told a different story. The vehicle had never left the state of Illinois, except to cross the border into Wisconsin. He had spent those 3 days at a luxury resort in Lake Geneva. The dot hovered mockingly over a private lakeside cabin that cost $1,200 a night. Then came the money. Naomi followed the digital breadcrumbs from the joint investment account I had contributed to every month for 5 years. We found a series of transfers labeled as high-risk real estate seed funding. The money was flowing into a shell company registered in Delaware called P&S Ventures. It did not take a genius to decode the acronym. Preston and Sienna. It was insultingly simple. Naomi dug deeper into the corporate filings of P&S Ventures. The company had no employees and no revenue, but it did have one significant expense. It was paying the lease on a 2-bedroom penthouse apartment in the Loop, overlooking Millennium Park. They were not just sneaking around in cars. They were playing house in a luxury nest funded by my salary. The rage that had been simmering in my gut began to boil, but I forced it down, transmuting it into cold, hard focus. The final blow came when Naomi cracked the encryption on Greg's cloud backup. She found a hidden folder containing chat logs from the encrypted messaging app Signal. It was a group chat titled The Boardroom. The participants were Preston, Greg, and a third number saved simply as Carter. I leaned in closer, my eyes scanning the scrolling text. It was a cesspool. They shared photos of expensive bourbons, complaints about our nagging, and explicit images that made my stomach turn. But then I saw my name. Preston had written a message at 11 at night on a Tuesday. "Mallory only knows how to work. She is as dry and hollow as one of her shipping containers. Sienna is different. Sienna is fire." I stared at the screen. Dry as a shipping container. That was how he saw the woman who managed the logistics of his entire comfortable life. The woman who ensured his shirts were pressed, his taxes were filed, and his refrigerator was stocked. I did not cry. I did not throw the laptop. I felt the last tether of emotional attachment snap. If he wanted fire, I would burn his entire world to the ground, but I would do it with the precision of a controlled demolition. I reached into my bag and pulled out 3 military-grade encrypted hard drives. "Copy everything," I told Naomi. "We need redundancy. 1 copy for Blair, 1 for you, and 1 for me." We were not just going to delete these files, we were going to weaponize them. As the progress bar loaded, we turned our attention to the third man, Carter. We needed to know who else was part of this toxic little fraternity. Naomi ran a reverse lookup on the phone number. The results popped up instantly. The number belonged to Carter Sterling. The name was familiar. He was the husband of Evelyn Sterling, the formidable president of the local charity women's association and the most socially powerful woman in Oak Brook. I looked at Blair and Naomi. The scope of our operation had just expanded. We were no longer just taking down 2 cheating husbands. We were about to start a war that would engulf 3 of the most prominent families in the district. I picked up my phone. I needed to make a call to Evelyn. We selected the date with the dispassionate logic of generals planning a bombardment. Our 10th wedding anniversary was exactly 2 weeks away. It was the perfect blast radius. Preston, in a display of narcissism that bordered on the pathological, actually suggested we hire Sienna to handle the decorations for the party. He sat at the kitchen table, eating the eggs I had cooked. Sienna has a great eye for romantic aesthetics, he said, not even looking up from his phone. It might be nice to give her a shot. I did not stab him with the fork. Instead, I smiled. It was a smile I had practiced in the rearview mirror, one that reached my eyes just enough to mask the predatory intent behind it. That is a brilliant idea, I replied sweetly. In fact, why don't we let her design the entire event space? We can frame it as a way to give her business some brand exposure. Preston beamed, thinking he had pulled off the ultimate deception, getting his wife to bankroll his mistress's career. He had no idea he was paying for the stage where his execution would take place. While I managed the social engineering, Blair was assembling the legal arsenal. She drafted a unilateral divorce petition, a court order for an immediate asset freeze, and a dossier detailing Preston's embezzlement of company funds. This was the nuclear option. We were not just going to leave them, we were going to make them uninsurable. Meanwhile, Naomi sat in my living room and remotely installed spyware onto the phones of Preston, Greg, and Carter. The software would turn their devices into listening bugs, recording every conversation and syncing it to our cloud server. The final piece of the alliance was Evelyn Sterling. I met her at her country club, a fortress of old money and exclusion. Evelyn was a woman who wore pearls like armor. When I showed her the transcripts of Carter's chats and the photos of the 3 men mocking us, she did not weep. She went very still. She took a long drag from her slim cigarette and looked at the evidence with the detachment of a coroner. I suspected Carter was weak, she said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. But I did not realize he was stupid. Evelyn joined Operation Clearance instantly. She did not want comfort. She wanted vengeance. She insisted on upgrading the venue. She rented the grand ballroom at the Sapphire Pier, a location that cost $50,000 for a single evening. Bill it as the night of truth and love, she instructed. She used her influence to ensure that Preston's CEO and the biggest investors in the city would be on the guest list. She wanted an audience for the slaughter. For the next 14 days, I performed the role of the devoted wife with Academy Award-winning precision. I ironed Preston's shirts. I kissed him goodbye in the mornings, tasting the coffee on his breath and fighting the urge to vomit. I listened to him talk about his stress at work, nodding sympathetically while I mentally cataloged the lies. Every kindness I showed him was a calculated deposit into a bank account that I was about to close forever. There was one moment where the facade almost cracked. 2 nights before the party, Preston tried to open the wall safe in our master bedroom to retrieve his watch. He frowned, spinning the dial. "Mallory," he called out, "why doesn't the combination work?" My heart hammered against my ribs, a sudden spike of adrenaline. I had changed the code to secure my passport and the birth certificates. I kept my voice steady, my eyes focused on the book I was pretending to read. The security system required a mandatory firmware update. I lied effortlessly. It forced a password reset for insurance compliance. Try the code 7742. He entered the fake code and the door swung open. He bought it without question, too arrogant to believe his logistical wife would ever lock him out of his own life. He had no idea the locks were already changed, and he was already on the outside looking in. The countdown to the event stood at 72 hours when the nature of the war shifted from a skirmish to a fight for survival. I was reviewing the data intercepts from Naomi's server when a new image file appeared in Preston's encrypted chat log. It was not a photo of a hotel room or a receipt for a dinner. It was a grainy, black and white medical scan, a sonogram. Sienna was pregnant. The air in my home office seemed to vanish, leaving a vacuum that made my ears pop. The logic of Preston's recent financial maneuvers suddenly crystallized. The accelerated transfers to P&S Ventures, the frantic pace of his liquidation strategy. It was not just about funding a mistress. He was capitalizing a second family. He was planning to leave me, and he was planning to take the entirety of our accumulated wealth to build a nursery for his new heir. I did not have time to process the betrayal. I had to secure the assets. I called Blair, and within 45 minutes, we walked into the main branch of our bank. I was a co-signer on every account, a detail Preston had overlooked in his arrogance. I demanded the branch manager print out the last 12 months of transaction histories for every linked account, including the wire transfers to the shell company. I watched the manager stamp each page with the bank's official red seal, certifying them as legal documents. These were not just pieces of paper. They were the ammunition I needed to prove he was dissipating marital assets in anticipation of a divorce. While I was securing the paper trail, Naomi was conducting a digital infiltration. She had gained remote access to the audio-visual system of the Sapphire Pier Ballroom. The venue had a default password on their server that they had never bothered to change. Naomi located the file named Anniversary Montage, a saccharine collection of photos from our wedding and vacations that Preston had asked his assistant to compile. She deleted it. In its place, she uploaded a new file. This one contained the video of the driveway, the screenshots of the texts, and the spreadsheet of the stolen funds. She locked the file with a rolling encryption code so no one at the venue could open it to check the content before the projector turned on. Evelyn was moving pieces on the social chessboard. She made personal calls to the CEO of Preston's firm and the 3 largest angel investors in the city. She framed the invitation as an exclusive networking opportunity that they could not afford to miss. She guaranteed their attendance because she knew that Preston's entire self-worth was tied to the approval of these men. When he fell, he would fall in front of the very gods he worshipped. Preston came home late that evening, carrying the cloying scent of cheap vanilla perfume and a small velvet box. He smiled that charming, hollow smile. "I picked up a little something early for the anniversary," he said. I opened the box to find a platinum pendant. My eyes narrowed. I recognized the design immediately. It was from a jeweler downtown that was currently running a specific promotion: buy a diamond engagement ring over 2 carats. Get the platinum pendant for free. He had bought Sienna an engagement ring. I was wearing the promotional freebie. I let him fasten the clasp around my neck. The cold metal felt heavy against my skin, like a shackle. I looked in the hallway mirror. I did not see a wife wearing a gift. I saw a knight buckling on a piece of armor. This necklace was not a token of affection. It was a war trophy I had claimed before the battle even started. The final war council took place in Blair's corner office, overlooking the Chicago skyline. We sat around a glass table, the 3 of us, finalizing the sequence of events. Blair emphasized that the moral failing of adultery would get the crowd's attention, but the financial fraud was what would ensure Preston never worked in this town again. We had to destroy his professional credibility. If he was just a cheater, he might survive. If he was a thief who stole from his own family, he was a liability to every business partner in the room. Just as we were packing up the files, my phone buzzed on the table. It was a text message from Sienna. "I am so excited for the party. You are going to be so surprised by what I have done with the place." I stared at the screen, marveling at the spectacular irony. She thought she was teasing a floral arrangement. She had no idea she was walking into a slaughterhouse of her own making. I did not reply. I simply turned off the phone and prepared for the end of the world. The morning of the party broke with a sky the color of a bruised plum. I woke at 5:30, long before the alarm was set to ring. I rolled over and looked at Preston. He was sleeping deeply, his mouth slightly open, one arm thrown carelessly over his head. In the dim light, he looked almost innocent, like the man I thought I had married 8 years ago. I waited for the familiar wave of nausea to hit me, but it never came. Instead, I felt a profound, weightless sense of relief. The acting was over, the script was written, the stage was set, and today, the curtain would finally fall. I showered and began the ritual of preparing for battle. Preston had laid out a pale pink chiffon dress for me the night before. "I love how soft and feminine this makes you look," he had said. I left it on the hanger. I walked to the back of the closet and pulled out a garment bag I had hidden there 3 days ago. I zipped myself into a sheath of crimson silk. It was structured, sharp, and aggressive. It was not the color of a wife. It was the color of a warning label. When I looked in the mirror, I did not look soft. I looked like a blade. The Sapphire Pier ballroom was breathtaking. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, the water churning dark and cold against the concrete pilings. I had to admit, Sienna had talent. She had transformed the space with cascading floral arrangements and ambient lighting that made everyone look younger and richer. It was a beautiful stage for a public execution. Guests began to filter in at 7 o'clock, the air filled with the hum of expensive conversation and the clink of crystal. Then, she arrived. Sienna walked through the double doors wearing white. Not cream, not ivory, but a stark, bridal white. It was a statement of such breathtaking audacity that I almost laughed. She made a beeline for Preston, placing a proprietary hand on his forearm while I was stuck by the entrance greeting his distant cousins. She was playing the role of the main character in my life, oblivious to the fact that she was about to be written out of the show entirely. I scanned the room. The targets had congregated at the mahogany bar. Preston, Greg, and Carter were holding tumblers of scotch, throwing their heads back in laughter. They looked untouchable. They radiated the arrogance of men who had never been told no. They did not notice that they were being hunted. In the far corner, Naomi stood by the audiovisual booth, her eyes locked on Greg. Near the kitchen, Evelyn was watching Carter with a glass of champagne in her hand, her expression as unreadable as a sphinx. We were positioned like snipers on a ridge. The heavy wooden doors opened one last time, and the CEO of Preston's real estate firm walked in. This was the VIP. I intercepted him immediately, flashing my most charming smile. I guided him personally to table 1, a prime spot dead center in the room. I wanted to ensure he had an unobstructed view of the projection screen. He thanked me, complimenting my dress and telling me how lucky Preston was. "Preston is incredibly lucky," I agreed. "Right up until the moment he isn't." I looked over at Naomi. She adjusted a knob on the soundboard and caught my eye. She gave a subtle, barely perceptible nod. The system was primed. I looked at Evelyn. She signaled the head waiter. Within seconds, I heard the heavy click of the side exit locks engaging. The staff had been instructed to secure the perimeter for privacy. In reality, they had just sealed the trap. The room was full. The ambient noise was at its peak. I walked up the 3 steps to the stage. The sound of my heels on the wood was sharp and rhythmic. I took the microphone from the stand. The spotlight swung around and hit me, blindingly bright. Preston looked up from his drink. He saw me in the red dress, bathed in light, and he smiled. It was a smug, self-satisfied smile. He raised his glass to me, expecting a toast to his success, to his perfect wife, to his perfect lie. He thought I was about to sing his praises. I tapped the microphone once. The sound echoed through the hall, silencing the chatter instantly. The room went dead quiet, all eyes fixed on the woman in red. I looked down at my husband. I did not smile. "Welcome, everyone," I said, my voice smooth, low, and terrifyingly calm. "I am so glad you could all be here tonight to witness this." We usually use these anniversaries to look back at the past. But tonight, I think we should focus entirely on the truth. Tonight is not just about celebrating the history we have written, I continued, my voice projecting clear and steady to the back of the silent room. It is about ensuring absolute transparency for the future. I raised my left hand, a sharp, deliberate signal to the control booth. The massive projection screen behind me, which was meant to display a montage of our romantic vacations in Napa Valley and Paris, flickered to life. But there were no sunsets or smiling faces. Instead, a high-resolution screenshot of a chat log appeared. The header read, "The Boardroom," in bold letters. The timestamp was from 3 weeks ago. The text was 10 feet tall. It was the conversation where Preston called me as dry as a shipping container and Greg bragged about his fishing trip that never happened. The vulgarity of the language, projected in stark white text against a black background, was shocking in the elegant ballroom. For a heartbeat, the room was completely silent, a vacuum where sound used to be. Then, I heard the distinct crash of glass shattering against the hardwood floor. Preston had dropped his tumbler of scotch. He was coughing violently, the liquid having gone down the wrong pipe. Greg and Carter stood beside him, their faces draining of color until they looked like wax figures. Sienna, standing near the front, froze mid-step, her hand covering her mouth. I did not give them time to recover. "Next slide," I commanded. The screen shifted. The static image was replaced by a video file. It was the footage from my driveway. The quality was crystal clear. It showed the interior of the Range Rover. It showed Preston's head thrown back. It showed his shirt unbuttoned to his navel. And it showed Sienna, her face clearly visible, leaning over him with an intimacy that made the air in the room turn icy. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, a sound like all the oxygen being sucked out of the room at once. I watched Preston's CEO, the man who prided himself on family values and corporate integrity, squint his eyes. He leaned forward, studying the screen with the same intensity he used to examine a contract. He was not looking at the sex, he was looking at the timestamp. "This data was collected on the morning of October 14th, I said. My tone was devoid of emotion. I sounded exactly as I did when presenting the quarterly supply chain variance report to the board of directors. While my husband claimed to be in a breakfast meeting with a client, he was actually conducting this particular transaction. Now, let us move on to the financial report." The video cut out. In its place appeared a complex Excel spreadsheet. This was my domain. I had highlighted the relevant rows in bright yellow. "These columns represent unauthorized withdrawals from our joint family trust and the corporate expense account," I explained, using a laser pointer to circle the figures. "Over the last 6 months, $45,000 was transferred to a shell company called P&S Ventures." I clicked the remote again. A new document appeared. It was an invoice. The funds were categorized as construction materials for a site in the West Loop. I continued. "However, as you can see from the bank routing number, the recipient is not a lumberyard. It is the personal checking account of Miss Sienna Miller, our interior designer." The room erupted into murmurs. Sienna let out a strangled sob, and suddenly, everyone knew exactly who she was. The spotlight of public shame shifted onto her, hot and blistering. "That is a lie," Preston screamed. His voice was high and cracked, stripped of its usual baritone confidence. He lunged toward the stage, his face twisted into a mask of panic and rage. "These are fakes, deep fakes." He made it 3 steps before 2 men in dark suits stepped out from behind the curtains. They were built like linebackers, security contractors Evelyn had hired specifically for this moment. They caught Preston by the arms, halting his momentum with effortless brutality. He struggled, shouting that the images were fake, but he was pinned. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply looked at him. "I am not finished," I said. From the wings of the stage, Evelyn and Naomi stepped out into the light. They walked to the center and stood on either side of me. We formed a wall. Naomi held a tablet. and Evelyn held a thick stack of legal documents. Evelyn took the microphone from my hand. Her voice was regal and dripping with disdain. "We have additional data regarding Mr. Greg Henderson and Mr. Carter Sterling," she announced. "And unlike my husband's charity work, these disclosures are entirely for profit." The screen flashed again. This time, it showed Greg's secret credit card statements and Carter's messages to an escort service. The scope of the betrayal widened, engulfing the other two men who were now trying to back away toward the locked exits. It was no longer a domestic dispute. It was a collective purge. Preston was trashing in the guard's grip, letting out a high-pitched, desperate sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. He was babbling incoherently, begging anyone to listen, trying to twist his body to find a sympathetic face in the crowd. But the pathetic noise died in his throat as Blair stepped out from the wings of the stage. She did not need a spotlight. She carried a thick, leather-bound portfolio, and she walked with the heavy, deliberate steps of a judge entering a courtroom. Blair took the microphone from Evelyn. Her voice was crisp, cutting through Preston's hysteria like a scalpel. "These are not digital manipulations," Blair declared. She held up the file, waving it slightly so the heavy paper rattled. "These are notarized bank statements with the official seal of the bank, legally obtained by Mallory as a joint account holder. The GPS data has been subpoenaed and verified by a third-party forensic digital analyst." She looked directly at the three men. "There is no way out. You have been caught in 4K resolution and stamped with a federal notary seal." The reaction from the floor was immediate and devastating. The CEO of Preston's real estate firm stood up from table 1. His face was a dangerous shade of purple, not from embarrassment, but from fury. His company's reputation was built on trust and financial integrity, and Preston had just incinerated that brand in front of the city's elite. He did not wait for a private meeting on Monday morning. He pointed a trembling finger at Preston. "You are fired," he shouted across the room. "Effective immediately for gross misconduct and embezzlement of corporate funds. Legal action will follow. Next to him, Evelyn's husband, Carter, looked as if he might faint. Evelyn did not give him the mercy of collapsing. She picked up the microphone again. "Carter," she announced to the room, "I have just instructed our family office to freeze all assets. Your allowance is revoked, your inheritance is annulled, and the seed capital for your pretentious startup company has been withdrawn. You are now a man with a famous last name and a bank balance of 0. I watched Sienna out of the corner of my eye. She had stopped crying and was now trying to make herself invisible. She began to edge toward the side door, hoping to slip away into the night. But she had underestimated the cruelty of the social hierarchy. As she tried to pass a table of wealthy matrons, they did not move aside. They stood up, blocking her path with a wall of silk and diamonds. They looked at her with a withering, collective sneer. She was the interloper, the homewrecker, the thief. She was trapped in the center of the room, stripped of her dignity, with nowhere to hide. Greg, the man who had bragged about fishing while cheating on his wife, collapsed to his knees. He reached out for Naomi's hand, sobbing. "Please," he begged. "It was a mistake. Forgive me." Naomi looked down at him with the dispassionate curiosity of a scientist examining a bug. She did not offer him a tissue. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a folded document. She handed it to him. "This is a divorce petition," she said simply. "It is already signed and notarized." I turned my attention back to Preston. The security guards had released him, but he could not stand upright. He was slumped against the edge of the stage, shaking uncontrollably. In the span of 10 minutes, he had lost his job, his reputation, his lover, and his access to my money. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and wet, searching for the woman who used to iron his shirts. That woman was gone. I leaned into the microphone for the final time. "Preston," I said, "you always preached about the importance of transparency in business." I looked him dead in the eye. "This is absolute transparency." There was no screaming match. I did not slap him. I did not cry. I simply let the weight of the evidence crush him. The guests, sensing the show was over, began to turn away. It was a synchronized movement, a collective shunning. They turned their backs on Preston, Greg, and Carter, forming a solid wall of indifference. The three men were left alone in the crowd, isolated in a room full of people, exiled from the world they thought they owned. I walked down the stairs of the stage, the heels of my shoes striking the floor with a rhythm that sounded like a judge's gavel. The crowd parted for me, a sea of expensive suits and evening gowns dividing to create a path straight to the corner where Preston was huddled. He looked small. The man who always filled a room with his loud voice and broad shoulders had shrunk into a terrified child. He saw me coming and tried to straighten his spine, attempting one last desperate maneuver from his playbook of manipulation. He reached out a shaking hand, trying to touch my arm, but I stepped just out of his range. "Mallory," he whispered frantically, "you are ruining everything. We can fix this. Think about the life we built. Think about everything we have constructed together." I reached into my clutch and pulled out the heavy set of brass keys that had started this entire chain of events, the keys to the cold storage warehouse. I looked at them for a moment, the cold metal biting into my palm. I dropped them at his feet. They hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, final clatter. "I retrieved my keys," I told him. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the single silver key to our front door. I tossed it onto his chest. It bounced off his tie and landed next to the others. "I am returning the house key to you. It is no longer my home." Blair stepped forward, flanking me on the right. She slapped a heavy file folder onto the high-top table next to Preston. She opened it to a page flagged with a yellow sticky note. "Here is the deal," she told the three men. "Sign the divorce agreements right now. You cede 100% of the marital assets to your wives and accept full fault. Or we hand the unredacted evidence of your financial fraud and embezzlement over to the district attorney before the sun comes up." Preston, Greg, and Carter looked at each other. They looked at the exits, which were blocked by security. They looked at their bosses and investors, who were staring at them with open hostility. They realized there was no escape route. The logic was absolute. They could choose poverty, or they could choose prison. Preston picked up the pen. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely grip the barrel. He looked up at me one last time, his eyes wet, searching for a trace of the woman who used to make him coffee and listen to his stories. He wanted pity. He wanted me to tell him it would be okay. But I looked at him with the clinical detachment of a warehouse manager identifying a defective pallet that needed to be discarded. I felt nothing but the satisfaction of a job completed under budget and ahead of schedule. He signed his name. The scratching of the pen on the paper was the loudest sound in the room. Greg signed next, weeping openly. Carter signed last, his face gray and defeated. I picked up the signed documents and verified the signatures. I closed the folder and handed it to Blair for safekeeping. Then I turned my head slowly toward the corner where Sienna was standing. She was trembling, her mascara running down her face in black streaks. I walked over to her, invading her personal space until she flinched. I did not shout. I kept my voice low and professional. "The invoice for redesigning my entire life will be sent directly to your lawyer," I told her. I turned around. Naomi and Evelyn were waiting for me. We did not say a word to the guests. We did not apologize for the scene. We simply aligned ourselves in a formation and walked toward the main exit. The crowd parted again, this time out of fear and respect. We left the three men amidst the ruins of their own making, surrounded by a room full of people who would never trust them again. I pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the biting Chicago night. The air was sharp and clean, scrubbing the scent of expensive perfume and desperation from my lungs. I walked past the Range Rover, which was parked in the VIP spot. I did not even glance at it. I walked straight to my Volvo XC90. I unlocked the door, the lights flashing a friendly greeting. I got in, started the engine, and merged onto the highway. For the first time in my life, I had no destination, no schedule, and no map. I just drove into the dark. beautiful freedom. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please comment below and let me know where you are listening from. I would love to connect with you all. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.